fight with the British broke out. And so we had committees of safety dotted all around, and I was in charge of ours over in the Woodstock area. My church that I pastored was a little log church, wasn't a large church, didn't have a large congregation. But in serving there in the Virginia House of Burgesses and taking the message of my faith to government, which we all believed that we should do. You see, in my day, we did not have this idea that I hear you have. See, what do you call it? Separation of church and state. What in the world is that? I hear that you're very concerned about being politically correct. We were more concerned about being biblically correct, not politically correct.
Amen.
And so I served in the House of Burgesses with Virginians you might know. A gentleman farmer with the name of Washington, Mr. George Washington. I also served with Mr. Patrick Henry, probably the finest Christian orator I've ever known. I was there March the 23rd, 1775 at St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond when he delivered that incredible speech. I remember the words like they were almost spoken yesterday. Especially the part where he said, "And his life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. Forbid it, Almighty God. I don't know what course others may take, but as for me, you can give me liberty, or you can give me death." Now I must tell you that when Mr. Henry made that dagger motion to his chest, and we all pulled in that great sigh, we realized the crisis that was upon us. I went back to my church. I continued to pastor my little church there in Woodstock, but Henry's words just wouldn't leave my head. Well, the king, he shut down the Virginia House of Burgesses, so we formed our own Congress. But those words just wouldn't leave my head. His life so dear, peace so sweet. So I told my church that January the 21st, 1776 would be my final Sunday as their pastor. Now they knew of all of my involvements, and I'm sure that they suspected a lot. But I went there that final day. My great-nephew, Henry Augustus Muhlenberg, wrote the entire account, 1849, if you care to read the story. But the short of it is, I went there with one purpose in my mind, and that was to draw a line and to call upon the men of my church and my community to stand for liberty, believing that Christians cannot have a secular box in their lives and a sacred box, and the two never meet. And so I got up when it was my time to preach. I preached from the 3rd chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Solomon says there's a time for all things in that chapter. But of course, verse 8 was my focus, where Solomon says there is a time of war and a time of peace. And so I read that passage, made a few opening comments, and then I closed my Bible. I climbed down out of my pulpits, which in those days were all elevated, and so I climbed down out of my pulpit, and I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Solomon was right. There's a time to preach, and there is also a time to pray. But sometimes it's time to fight. And that time has now come for me." Now, my congregation, as I said, were accustomed to my being very engaged, a pretty fiery soldier in the army of the Lord. But I wasn't quite certain they were prepared for the image of me they were about to see. And so I stepped off to the side, and you may know my story. And there I removed my preaching bands, which we preachers wore every Sunday when we preached. I pulled off my black clerical robe. All of us wore black robes in that day. It didn't matter whether you were Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran. We all wore our robes. And I revealed underneath my preaching robe a colonel's uniform. You see, Mr. Washington and Mr. Henry had recommended that I be commissioned as a colonel of a brand new regiment that was forming in Virginia, the 8th Regiment out of our colony, the 8th Virginia. And we were going to be a cavalry unit, and so you might say that I was trading in my preaching robe for a set of riding spurs. I led those gentlemen all the way through the war. As I stood before them in my uniform, I challenged my men. And I told them, I said, men, it is time for us to stand for liberty. Who will go with me? One by one, the men of my little congregation walked outside, signed their names beneath mine on the muster roll of the 8th Virginia Cavalry. Our community heard the commotion because I had positioned a drummer boy to be outside my church, and when I opened the door of the church, he began to roll on that drum as I was turning to encourage my men as the congregation stood and they were singing, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And men in the community began to hear the commotion and they came running. And they too were stirred and began to sign and join up. And so I led that regiment of men from 1776 all the way through to the end of the war, 1783. We fought in most of the major engagements of the war. We were in Yorktown. I'm actually in the painting that hangs in your National Rotunda Capitol today, the Capitol building. I'm in that painting at the surrender of Cornwallis. My statue stands today in Statuary Hall. There I stand with my sword sheathed to my left side, but flowing over my right arm and back behind me is the robe that I laid aside to lead the 8th Virginia. Now, I'm not the only one of my kind. And it wasn't just a handful of us rabble-rousers. Oh, no. No, there were preachers from every conceivable denomination in little hamlets and towns all over the colonies who believed that the church must be the tip of the spear. That if we would not lead out in the defense of liberty, who would? If we who had been set free by the blood of Christ could not appreciate liberty, who could? Amen. Who could? And so we led out. People like James Caldwell, Jonas Clark, the pastor over in Lexington, Massachusetts, William Emerson over in Concord, pastor after pastor after pastor, men like John Cleveland from Ipswich, Massachusetts, Charles Thompson, a Baptist over in Warren, Rhode Island, thrown in a prison ship, John Rossbrugg, a pastor over from the wilderness of New Jersey, brutally murdered by the Hessians, commanded by a British officer, murdered while trying to surrender. I can tell you story after story this evening of men and their families and their congregations who paid the price. It's why you have your liberty that you have today. We would probably never fought for our independence had it not been for the pulpit. Amen. So I'm here today to tell you that it is fitting. It's not only fitting, it's a responsibility for believers, men and women of faith, to take their stand for what is right. Amen. And to lead the way, not to follow behind. So it was my honor, it was my privilege to be a member of that black-robed regiment. A name given to us by the British, and yet a title we wear today with honor. With honor. Now, friends, I go all over the state and all over the country telling this story. Now, if you've seen my presentation, you know that it's a multimedia thing with all kinds of sound effects and you name it. And I tell these stories and we go into quotes and stories and facts. It's an amazing, amazing trip. But if all it is history, as amazing of a story as it is, if that's all it is, then there's not a lot of relevance. Not to us in the 21st century. But friends, I'm here to tell you, there is immediate relevance.
Amen.
Because just as the church presided over the sunrise of liberty in North America, if the church today does not wake up, we're going to preside over the sunset of liberty in North America.
Amen.
All of this has happened on our watch. So a few years ago, Paul and I, by God's providence, met together, became a part of the very first Pulpit Freedom Initiative that ADF launched back in 2008, became best of friends. We've traveled literally all over this country, sharing the story of how the church led out. It has been then a very natural extension for he and I, others, to then run for office as full-time pastors. Most of you know my story. I pastored over Trinity Baptist in Yukon from 92 to 2015, 23 years. While I was there as full-time pastor, I served 2 terms in the Oklahoma House of Representatives. Now, I ran at the same time that Paul ran the first time for the state Senate. The difference was I was in a rural district. It was an open seat. It was a little easier race for me than what he had here, running against Clark Jolly, ensconced with the establishment. He had to fight uphill all the way. But it was a natural extension for us to do this. People have asked me, well, Dan, did you consider quitting preaching? Well, heck no. Why would I want to do that? It's an extension of the ministry, not an ending of the ministry. See, the problem is we've just become so unaccustomed to men of God being just that, men of God. Who would you rather have leading in government? Somebody that knows and fears God, or someone who rejects God and hates Him? These are the choices before us these days. So for me to run for governor has not been a huge leap. Now, it's a huge leap. Let me assure you. I'm still wondering why in the world I took the leap. But it's really not a large step, because I believe that men and women of faith need to bring their faith into the marketplace of ideas just like all other people do. I have a number of people from time to time who'll say, well, Dan, what are you trying to do? Establish a theocracy? Which just shows the utter ignorance of the person who asked that question, because we have a representative republic here. You'd have to completely rework our government, do away with our founding documents to create a theocracy to begin with. No. But what I do want is men and women at the top of our government who honor and fear God. Amen. Because if we don't put people like that in, then we by default put people in who don't. And that's what we've been doing now for a number of decades. Amen. While the church has pursued this myth of separation of church and state. We've separated ourselves. We've taken all the salt and light out of secular government. Then we stand back and talk about how terrible it is that politics is such a dirty business. Right. Well, of course it is. We abandoned it. So, running for governor of Oklahoma. Scott Lively is running for governor of Massachusetts. It's very fitting that we do things like this.
Amen.
So we are here tonight to let you know that the church can and must stand up. We must. If we don't, friends, then we're going to leave the field to those who do not honor God, who do not believe in moral absolutes. And come on, we can see the consequences of that already. So it was an honor when Scott first visited with Paul about coming back to Oklahoma and spending just a little bit of time this evening sharing back and forth. And what the First Great Awakening generation did for our country was invaluable because it gave those sons and daughters, Peter Muhlenberg and others, the energy and the backing they needed to fight that war of independence. The question is, what will we do with what we've been handed? That generation did a pretty good job with what the Great Awakening generation had handed to them. What are we doing with what we've been given? And so I'm giving it everything that I have. Many of you know all about me. I'm going to hang around here for a little bit tonight. Be happy to answer questions. In fact, Paul is going to come here, I believe, and kind of orchestrate a little bit of Q&A time. But I'm going to hang around here afterwards. If you haven't gotten to see our little museum here, you need to take a look at it. We know the stories of all of these flintlocks and swords, and they're all the real deal. We have election sermons laid out here. We even have the personal effects of Samuel Gore, who's one of the Sons of Liberty, who was actually one of the participants in the Boston Tea Party. This is all his stuff back here. We'll be happy to tell you the story. Paul, why don't you take it from here, and we'll just do whatever you'd like to do as we kind of wrap it up.
What we're going to do here is I'm going to ask both of these men, as you